Well, I just wanted to quickly say who JSA is. JSA was founded in 1998. It is a non-profit organization, and the goal was to foster progressive writing, research, practice, and activism in all areas of criminal, social, transformative, and restorative justice. Through their activism, writing, research, and many other things, members seek to contribute toward justice without violence and to restore people to wholeness through interpersonal as well as social structural change. And so because of these goals and this mission at JSA, folks way back in the day, in the 1990s and 2000s, it seems recent, but it's been a while now. People created the Chomsky Award to acknowledge the advocacy and activism of people working for social change. And last year, we invited Erika. Well, we asked her if she would accept the recognition since 2020, way before the pandemic hit. And then, we canceled the conference and we were not able to come together and recognize her work and everything that she has been doing. So, and we decided on Erika because of her radical critiques of the capitalist carceral state, and especially her activism and work in collectivity with many other folks, queer, grassroots, women and people of color, all of them working together for a better world, for a just world. And so allow me to read a little bit of her bio here. Well, Erika Meiners is a writer, educator, and organizer. Her books include For the Children, Protecting Innocence in a Carceral State by the University of Minnesota in 2016. She has a co-edited anthology titled The Long Term, Resisting Life Sentences, Working Towards Freedom by Haymarket Press, 2018. She is the co-author of Feminist and the Sex Offender, Confronting Sexual Harm, Ending State Violence. This is by Verso in 2020. And she is also the co-author of the forthcoming book, Abolition, Feminism, Now, by Haymarket, and is coming soon. She has been a distinguished visiting scholar at a range of universities and centers, including Humboldt University, Trent University, CUNY Graduate Center, the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, and Chicago's Leather Archives and Museum. She has published numerous articles in a wide range of publications, including In These Times, Social Text, Radical Teacher, Women's Studies Quarterly, The Advocate, and Boston Review, among others. At Northeastern Illinois University, where Erika is a professor, she is also the member of her labor union, the University Professionals of Illinois, and she teaches classes in education, gender and sexuality studies, and justice studies. And as I mentioned before, one of the things that is unique in Erika is that she has worked in collaboration with many others on a range of ongoing mobilizations for liberation, particularly movements that involve access to free public education for all, including people during and after incarceration, and other queer abolitionist struggles. Erika is an active member of Critical Resistance and the Education for Liberation Network. She is a starter of the Illinois Death in Custody Project, the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project, the Sister Jane Adult High School, and a number of now sundown organizations such as TAME, Teachers Against Militarized Education. And finally, she is also a science fiction fan, and Navi runner, and a lover of bees and cats. Please welcome Erica Meiners.
Oh, thank you so much.
Let me stop this.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's really an honor to be here today amidst our multiple ongoing pandemics. I'm coming to you today from Chicago, the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi nations. I'm a little under the weather, but I am so thrilled to be here. I want to just offer my deep appreciation for all the labor that makes this fierce community and this conference stretched across time and space possible. Of course, my valued colleague and comrade, Dr. Maria de la Torre, and also the leadership of the Justice Studies Association. I know how difficult it is to pull events like this together. Maureen Whitcomb, Jordan Grasso, Ashley Kilmer, just deep gratitude for creating space in this moment. And it's also just particularly an honor to be recognized by comrades who I continue to learn from, who are members of this organization. Many, including Kayla Martinson, Chris Tofolo, Maria, all of your research, teaching, mentoring, and organizing makes a beloved community, as Marge Piercy would say, that I'm really honored to be associated with. Maria asked me to make some brief remarks, and I think I have sort of two-part remarks for about 10, 12 minutes. I want to make some quick comments about awards, and then I want to continue the theme of collectivization and just make some comments about this political moment and the power of collectives. So not too long. I know that all of you have probably been listening. It sounds like a marathon all day today, but I think hopefully they'll be provocative and helpful. So part one on awards, and I think awards are tricky. While it is absolutely wonderful to be recognized, it's also an opportunity to be reminded about the seductive fictions at the core of merit and excellence. My work continues to demonstrate to me that for every community leader or brilliant scholar, there are people, often women, who make that leader's work and brilliance possible. So that's comrades, lovers, sisters, compatriots, grandmothers, wives, students. Strong people don't need strong leaders, as the fierce civil rights advocate and organizer Ella Baker noted. And similarly, strong people don't fall for the line that they're more valuable than the folks with whom they are graced to live and work and organized. So while I'm honored to be recognized today, my organizing and scholarship, as Maria prefaced, is a product of ongoing collectives, collaborations, political engagements, and practices. Sometimes these communities are in the classroom. For example, students in my classes over the years at Northeastern Illinois University, at the Sister Gina Dent High School, at Stateville Prison, popular education workshops through the Anti-PIC Teaching Collective, and many other sites. Often the term students seems such an ill-advised term. Instead, the people with whom I'm in dialogue with, where we have the opportunity to ask questions sometimes that see beyond the given. These learning and teaching contexts continue to shape me in unfathomable ways. But beyond the classroom collective space, I continue to organize, write, and learn as an active member of a number of national and local social justice organizations and networks like Critical Resistance, a national anti-prison and abolitionist organization, and locally through the Sister Jean Adult High School, the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education Project, the Illinois Deaths in Custody Project, and previously through many other organizations. So through these networks and constellations, and the many organizers and thinkers, some inside and others outside of university walls. It's a list a little bit too lengthy to rehearse today. These communities continue to push me to be an ungrateful academic apprentice to ensure that I use the tools and resources available to build with others the world that we need now. So with this in mind, a reminder of the fictions of individualism and merit, and the recognition that learning and change is collective and in community. I just want to shift to my part two. I want to continue this theme of collectivism and just make a couple of remarks about this political moment that we're in to lift up the movements that have brought us to this moment. And here we are, right, in the middle of pandemics. For some, the visibility and traction of the demands to defund police that emerged in the spring of 2020 came as a surprise. I know not for probably folks on this call, but for many it did come as a surprise. Yet these demands surfaced after decades of organizing from a strong, contemporary, and collective abolitionist movement, galvanized by the landscape of racial violence in the United States. Our abolitionist present has been brought to us by decades of collective labor, specifically feminist organizing. And when I use the term feminism, I'm calling up a long genealogy of women of color, queer, radical. Often we use the word intersectional feminism. So I want to just take a minute, because I'm here in Chicago, to sketch this abolitionist feminist ecosystem that has created this political moment and will likely carry us through this political moment, co-optation, failed reforms, dilution to come, right? So over the last 2 decades in Chicago, a cluster of anti-violence groups, organizations, and networks emerged in response to the everyday forms of violence: street harassment, sexual assault, racism, transphobia, ableism, homophobia. Some of these organizations, and I'll just read a few names: The Long Walk Home, Mango Tribe, the Young Women's Empowerment Project, Gender Just, Aqua Moon, Gabriella Network Chicago, Females United for Action, Girl Talk, the Empowered Fifis, Rogers Park Young Women's Action Team. So it's just a name of about a dozen small organizations that were active in Chicago over the last 2 decades. So often created by and centering the experiences of young women of color and queer folks, these organizations recognize that the state, schools, social workers, law enforcement did not offer support or protection. And far from individual and private, the harm they experienced was endemic and state sanctioned. Demanding not simply services or recognition, but structural and systems change, these groups worked to create and practice collective responses to harm, particularly forms of gender and sexual violence. While only a very few of these organizations in Chicago explicitly identified as abolitionists during the early 2000s, their zines, spoken word events, street actions, and popular education workshops spotlighted the state's inability to even recognize sexual and gender violence as harm, particularly when experienced by young people of color. These organizations rejected the criminal legal system's ineffective and paltry responses, often naming this very system and its tentacles, including child and family services, as key perpetrators of harm. So over the first 2 decades of the new millennium, these tiny Chicago-based organizations hosted it all, rehearsing and strengthening muscles and tools for the now and the time to come, in basements, backyards, and classrooms and storefronts, in groups of 3 or 300, often with few or no paid staff. We held transformative justice skill shares, speakouts centering survivors of sexual violence, a summer communiversity on the prison industrial complex, fundraisers to support people inside. And I remember one distinctly that raised $261, reading and study groups on Hurricane Katrina, film screenings of documentaries like Visions of Abolition, Out in the Night, and Born in Flames, safety labs that offered people the opportunity to role play about how to intervene in everyday experiences of interpersonal harm without police, and much more. This body of labor, of creation, is really breathtaking. This slow work of building up our collective capacity to imagine and act in ways that do not expand the prison industrial complex, while also ending forms of harm, including gender and sexual violence, felt and still feels joyous and also painful, and yes, often exhausting. The 2-hour meeting that stretches into hour 3 and maybe never gets to past the introductions. A version of the same crucial question from a workshop participant. What about the really bad people? Sometimes energizing, always imperfect, and done with the expectation that change is relational. With scant resources, small networks like these continue to engage the always urgent, slow time of abolition. To some, when viewed outside of this genealogy, these small scattered events and campaigns and organizations are likely seen as disconnected, potentially failures, a laundry list of small organizations in one city, most of which have completely evaporated. Our feminist, queer, women of color history of resistances and organizing is often impoverished by intention, often lethally, and few traces remain of powerful and highly local organizations that built interesting campaigns, pushed back on state violence, and seeded shifts in language and culture. Our understanding of history, of the ecology of social and political change is intentionally narrowed, whitewashed, and straightened, too linear, and often in search of individuals and not collectives, legal and legislative wins and not processes, actions, and certainly not political education events. But far from a failure, this abolition feminist ecosystem, toolkits lost in boxes and on the internet, study into action groups that leaned into the first and forgot the second, sparsely attended independent documentary screenings, small clusters of militant picketers, campus groups that flared and dissipated. This is the ecology that grew the demand and the dialogue that prosecuting any one police officer or rapist could not be our only solution to end white supremacy and sexual violence. So in the context of the uprisings of 2020, this landscape and most of these small groups have been forgotten or invisible. And yet not only do they deserve to be recognized as one key facet of our pathway to this abolitionist present, but more critically, their erasure weakens our collective ability to struggle for the long haul. So today, between the anniversary of the murder of George Floyd and Juneteenth, on the eve of the 51st anniversary of the uprising of Stonewall led by trans organizers like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, we can't forget these important genealogies that have shaped this moment: collective struggle, feminist labor, abolitionist imaginations. These are the real award winners of this moment, past, present, and future. So in the spirit of these genealogies, which I think are reflected throughout the JSA program for this year's convening, which is chock full of dialogues about restorative justice practices, about resistances to militarization, about internationalism, and more. I just want to thank you for this recognition. And I also look forward to our collective work over the years to come and connecting with you on the pages of journals, in meetings, online, and in marches, and everywhere we are. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions. I know this is a long day for all of you, but I just want to thank you again.
Thank you, Erica. I just wanted to share, I don't know if you can see your recognition right there.
Yes, I love it. I'm going to put it up at the Prison Neighborhood Arts and Education office space, so thank you.
Well, you know, we do what we can in this virtual world. Thank you so much for your words of activism, as we say in Spanish, compromiso, you know, commitment to the struggle for a better world. I want to open up the space for dialogue and to see if people have questions or comments.
I just want to say I really appreciate you being here. You're a huge inspiration for me. You always have been. And I also just want to plug the book that's coming out because I can't wait for it. It's co-authored by such strong women that inspired me in so many different ways. So I'm just going to drop that in the chat just so you're aware of it. Yeah.
Thanks, Kayla, and great to see you. And we're just finishing it up, so I'm pretty excited. And also, you know, Kayla, some of the feminist ecosystem I was flagging in the conversation today, you know, Kayla has a long, not that long because you're not super old like me, but has a history also doing that work, and I think really central participant in some of the youth organizing. So thank you, great to see you, and great to be sharing space with you.
Thank you for plugging all of those orgs too. I was like, yes.
I know it was interesting because most of them, you know, have literally evaporated, and most of them had no paid staffer. So the archives for those organizations are in someone's closet. Like a couple of them are literally in the closet behind me, boxes, or in people's basements. And I think that you know, sort of the work of organizations like the Freedom Archives. I see 2 hands up, so I'll move on in a minute. People's Freedom Archives and other sort of, you know, people's archives that really collect and disseminate and share that work is important. So great.
Yeah, I have Girl Talks box in my closet, along with like some petty cash that's still left over. You brought up the $213, and I'm like, I think I have like $87 left in a folder from 7 years ago.
I know. I love that you haven't spent that and you're hanging on to it because we're going to need it.
I am.
Right. Maybe Rebecca, and then Ashley, if that's okay.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. You know, when you tell this history and you talk about many of these organizations don't exist anymore, how do we keep that collectiveness alive? If it's not written down somewhere, if it's, you know, if it just disappears as we disappear.
I mean, I think what we all know that sort of left social movements have a, you know, the work to sort of document left social movements. I mean, this community does some of that work, right? Which is imperative to really circulate and share the history of resistance movements, of social organizations, of campaigns and projects. So I think that that's why organizations like JSA are really imperative, because part of the work of those organizations is creating counter histories, critical genealogies, counter narratives, so that when people enter into spaces, they know histories of internationalist movements against militarization in the Philippines, for example, right? So I think just a plug for organizations like JSA, but I think we're always working against the logic of dominant structures and historical forces that have really little interest in small teenage girls of color in Rogers Park who were, who did years of, it's a neighborhood in Chicago, years of work to try to stop street harassment, and realized, the police and parents and schools didn't care. So it was on them to do like little marches in the neighborhood and raise the visibility of, street harassment that targeted girls of color, right? So I think, as somebody who has some institutional privileges, access to resources, and has a academic position, I think one of the things that we can proliferate is the communities that we're a part of, whether that's students or grad students or undergrad students, to really do the work to document, elevate, amplify those examples, and I think that often, the students that Maria and I and Kayla have the, honor to work alongside are often first-gen students of color who have, deep connections to some of these very grassroots forms of organizing and mobilization. So really encouraging them to see them as sites of knowledge production, which they are, right? See them as sites of community building and leadership, and to sort of lean into that work. And sort of, bring it in all of its complexity, into some of these spaces is important. So, but I also, the challenge of some of these Q&As is I always want to say, if you ask that question, you have a great response. I would love to hear your response as well.
I think it's so hard to document it because you're so busy doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
And hard to justify stepping back and saying we need to capture this moment too.
Yeah. I think one recognition for me was like rethinking also success and failure that came a little bit later in the work. Like so many of these organizations had, that I've been a part of for the last 25 years had like visionary. I remember Kayla and I had a conversation about this a while ago, had like very visionary horizons. And of course we were not able to end gender and sexual violence, for example, but that was a campaign project and a demand. And how the logics of what counts as winning are so narrow that instead of sort of seeing the work that we did and the interventions that we made and the political education as an incredible value, like we sort of looked, we kind of looked and felt like a lot of like, oh, it didn't work, we didn't last, right? So I think really, the work is also, on us. And I think this was hard learned by me. And it took sort of working with people who were elders of me and who'd been in it for the long haul to say, you gotta, success and failure is a very kind of narrow, kind of whitewashed, capitalistic, dynamic that's always framed by the guys who win, right? So instead, let's think about the kind of work that we do through different metrics. And I think that was very sort of liberating for me, but also kind of liberating to share kind of, to sort of proliferate in how I think about work rather than thinking like, oh, that campaign didn't actually shut down the construction of that, didn't actually, shut down that prison, it led to X, Y, and Z, that was a failure, but instead thinking like, what's all the political education that campaign produced? What's all the community? What's all the, kind of, and that's actually a value. Yeah. Ashley?
Yeah. Hi. My question's about kind of what has been your experience or advice of having conversations around this type of work in a classroom setting? I know I've been encountering over the last year or so kind of two conflicting things going on. One is that students seem more open and receptive to ideas that are critical, that are they're more willing to engage in conversations around abolition more so than I encountered in the past. But then at the same time, while this is occurring, critical theories, feminist theories are under an intensive public scrutiny and being weaponized by politicians and lawmakers. And so I'm finding it difficult to know how to tread in terms of having the conversations around these types of work and movements in the classroom. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to your experience to that.
Yeah, great question, Ashley. Thank you for that. And I think, both it's it speaks to the power of ideas that critical race theory is, being, widely, challenged by, I think the framework of left and the right isn't that helpful anymore, but I'll just use the framework of the term the right as a shorthand here. So I think it speaks to the incredible power of ideas that, and it's not a new thing, whether it was, I remember when I started teaching, I have a friend who was teaching in Georgia and they were trying to sort of defund women's and gender studies programs 20 years ago because they were teaching, around feminist and queer issues around sexuality that was seen as challenging. So I think that these aren't new, it's not sort of a new threat. I think that on my, one strategy is, I feel like I'm on the same message that Maria started us out with, collectivization, not that that's the answer, that's not that that's like a simple checklist, but I have felt, and I'm, differentially positioned, I'm a white person, with an advanced degree who has now a tenure job, and has an institutionalized position, and I'm living in Chicago. But I have felt that, working at an institution that has a labor union, offers, affords some, measures of protection. So I think, the container of organized labor isn't perfect. Organized labor has a history of like locking out workers of color, for example. But I think that, so I always advise people like kind of figure out where you're working, what your working conditions are, right? Just as like, my first job was working at Dairy Queen. So I had to figure out like, how can I keep my job and not get fired, right? I think the same is true of academic positions, like trying to sort of, not sort of strip away the romance of those kinds of jobs and try to say, what do we, what are the tools and resources available to us in these positions, and how can we use them to organize, and how can we, protect ourselves? So I think, and also, building community, right? I think I feel fortunate that I live in a city that has, people inside and outside the university. So trying to find kind of supportive community-based organizations, supportive student unions. I mean, universities are fairly rigid hierarchies, right? Where the base of the people are the workers and the undergraduate students. So, if you're fortunate to work at a place that has, either labor unions that kind of help collectivize the base, or progressive student organizations, those can often be really strong allies in doing this work, so that you can't get, picked off. But I remember when I was, starting out, I organized a protest at Wheaton College, which is a restrictive enrollment Christian university that made all their faculty at the time sign an anti-gay lifestyle statement. And we didn't organize an action there, and that president of that university called the provost of my university to try to have me sort of sanctioned, right? And it was scary, right? So I don't want to dismiss the kind of this political moment and the consequences for different kinds of people, right? We don't all enter into those risks, with the same body, the same histories, the same experiences. But my responses might be to think about collectivizing, thinking about knowing the condition, our working conditions of where we work, thinking about ways to form, strategic alliances with kind of groups of people, whether it's undergraduate students that are progressive, whether it's community-based organizations on the outside, right? Because we aren't going to win, this political moment, being the lone faculty member in the classroom. We have to, work collaboratively to shift the narrative. And I think that's what, the right, not to be too truncated with right and left again here, the right is afraid of, right? So I think the more that we can, move with sort of like, loving, vibrancy, because, we are right. I think about the calcification of Trump's response to the 1619 project, came out right after he kind of lost the election. There was that sort of, presidential commission trying to challenge the 1619 project. And, it was so, if academics refused to participate in it, it was so kind of hollow as a framework, right? But it's going to have traction. So that wasn't a super thorough response, Ashley, because I think it's an important question, and I'm always looking for new ways to engage that question. How do we support ourselves to continue to do radical work?
And I think you bring up such a good point of the context that we're working within of being juniored versus tenure, of having a union for support, of what the department culture is, even irregardless of more broad institutional culture. And all of that kind of plays a role in how, I guess, forward and out you can be in terms of supporting certain types of causes and movements. I know as a junior faculty, I often feel very vulnerable. And the unfortunate consequence of that is you end up kind of self-censoring and regulating as a self-preservation mechanism. And so, yeah, I appreciate that response. And the idea of kind of aligning with those that might have more institutional support and protections might be a good way to kind of circumvent that somewhat too.
Yeah, it's funny. I teach at a prison as well, and we have to have all of our curriculum and materials approved by the prison. But working there over the last 10 years has made me think a lot about the logic of the prison and sort of how we try to sort of sneak around or negotiate the logic of the prison. It's made me think a lot about sort of how not dissimilar, it's kind of grammatically, how similar often that is to the logic of the university. And one thing that we always say, kind of working at the prison, is that we shouldn't be anticipating the logic of the prison and sort of censoring ourselves, like, oh, they're not going to accept that book, so we shouldn't even try to get it cleared. And I feel sort of like, similarly, two fancy theorists, Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, are always saying, we need to be in the university, but not of the university, right? Like, how do we kind of negotiate that dynamic, which is, easier for some bodies than other bodies. But I think their principle there is a kind of an interesting one. How do we, how do we sort of occupy that space and take the resources and, but not kind of fully, assimilate into the logics of the institution, because I think they are, you got to be safe until so you can get into a PhD program, and you got to be safe so you can finish your dissertation, and you got to be safe so you can get a job, and you got to be safe so you can get tenured. And I think that script is a script for, being really depressed. And I think that script is also, just a lie, right? Because you can do everything right and still, not make it through that, but also, I'm just, rattling on here, but I think it's a really key question. And I hear that from a lot of people. I mean, there's so many shrinking access to the tenure track lines in this moment. It's just a reminder that we got to know what the rules are and the cost of breaking the rules, but we can't necessarily, if we invest in the institution's rules, what are we buying into at the end of the day? But thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question, or I wanted to hear from you, Erica, about, with the, it's not new, police violence and killings of brown and black bodies and people. But with the pandemic, it seemed that, but especially, with the killing of George Floyd, I was struck by the fact that these images, this message, this killing was disseminated throughout the globe, that people in many other countries knew who George Floyd was, who he is, his memory, and knew about the police violence. And then in other countries, in other localities, people and activists started to share their stories of police violence as well. So one of the questions that I've been asking is, or in my mind, is, we're facing systems that they're bounded by the nation state, but they're larger than that, right? These are systems that are the same almost in around the globe. So how do you start fighting at that level? It's not possible probably, but what do you do? Considering there is this structural violence that is a historical legacy of slavery and many other systems of oppression, but at the same time, it's, you do something when you educate people, right? You change consciousness, you affect policies. That helps a bit. I mean, it helps for so many people at that little level, I'm glad for some regulations and laws that exist against, gender violence and all that. So I have those thoughts. I know they're very well formed or expressed at this moment, but so the question is, how do you work at the local level, but also try to address these global systems?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think my short answer would be like, you answered the question in your own great question. But they are internet. I have been, over the last 25 years that I've been doing this organizing, continually transformed by the internationalist nature of these forms of resistance, right? That people in rural, communities, Aboriginal, Australia, have and are, been waging campaigns against the violence of policing and directly linking it to colonialism, and, having marches, amplifying the Black Lives Matter and seeing their struggle as directly connected to, the struggle in the United States. So I think that those connections are, the first word that comes to mind, infectious, but that's such a bad word to use right now, but they're interconnected, they're vibrant. And so I think that our work is always, to be working, I believe the work is to do work locally, but to always have this sort of internationalist lens and be making these kinds of connections, in part because, we know that the prison industrial complex is global, whether it's, the new company that's doing, making electronic monitoring, right? They're selling electronic monitoring devices in the United States, in South Africa, in UK, right? They're building private immigration prisons, globally, right? In Australia, right? Here, right? So, we need to be making those kinds of connections. And I think that's why convenings, are often important. I've been a part of, through organizing many different convenings where we have to really be intentional in making space for slowing down, trying to be internationalists. Like, how can we connect with and learn from organizing on the ground that's happening in London, or in Brazil or in South Africa, right? Because we have a lot to learn, right, about both strategies and movements. And I don't think it's, I think the purpose of the kind of comments I offered about Chicago is that we also learn a lot from kind of a deep-rooted look at one particular space and place, but at the same time, looking and being interconnected. So I think convenings are one way. I think in this kind of world of Zoom, it's also an opportunity to have sort of an internationalist connections. And so I've been heartened by that. That's one sort of value of the pandemic, has been the ability to learn, alongside organizers of, all different kinds of, although the time zone situation, a challenge. But I think that's that's always been the in my experience and my learning also of social movements, trying to think and act locally, but also have an internationalist analysis and, and attention and focus, because we can't be, doing one thing here that's also, that's not connected to or reverberating or has sort of tentacles that are learning from and building up and building relationality, about what's happening beyond the artificial, US nation state borders. I think organizing does that somewhat organically, as you pointed out in the question, like, whether it was the murder of, George Floyd, and then seeing, in Palestine, the murals that have George Floyd's, face on it, whether it's, the example I offered in First Nations communities, or Aboriginal communities in Australia. I think that people are making these connections. So it's not a hard fit, but making sure that I think in the United States, we're so US centric, right? And I think that, really trying to destabilize that takes a conscious effort on the back, for us, those of us who are, housed in some way, shape, or form in, within, United States nation state borders, to really kind of work carefully to always think with an internationalist lens and destabilize the sort of centrality of us and our work and our thinking and our analysis. And I don't think we do that very well. So yeah, great question.
I have another question.
No, great. As you were talking about the work of organizing never ends, and sometimes you just raise the $200, right? And you needed 2,000. Yes.
Right? How do you deal with burnout? Because it happens, right?
Yeah. I'm just thanking Susan for her work and for attending today. Yeah, burnout. Yes. I mean, I think it's both. Organizing is always the third or fourth shift, right? Whether after paid work, after, the unpaid care work that, all of us do, right, on this call, whether it's caring for, loved ones or dependents. So I think organizing is always the third or fourth shift, right, for people. I mean, I think for me, I'm not going to romanticize it and say it's all wonderful, but it's also really joyous. And I think it has made my scholarly life much more possible and interesting. Working in community, working on projects, most of the writing projects that I have been involved in have been our collaborations with people that I've also worked alongside or with. The writing projects are an attempt to try to work through or understand problems that have come up from practice. I think in that way, it's a little bit, that addresses, helps address some of the alienation of living in a white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy, but also working in a university context. And it also addresses a little bit of the, organizing burnout. Like it's energizing to think and work alongside people and to sort of co-produce and co-analyze and, co-struggle. So I think that is not a full response, neither one of those that, organizing is hard, does lead to burnout, right? And again, my theme that if we see ourselves as part of communities rather than just individuals, no campaign is going to win or lose if I, can't show up for something, right? So I think it's building, beloved communities to do the work for the long haul, so that, we're not the only ones, folding up the chairs at the end of the meeting or, remembering, to send out that email or, et cetera. So, but as as often I look around and there's this sort of a lot of young people, and then there's like elders, and then there's like a kind of, middle group of people that are around my age that are often like less visible. And I think that's largely because of the constraints of, care work, unpaid care work, right? That people are negotiating. People are trying to look after loved ones, and I think people who are older or often, younger are a little bit free of those constraints, right? So, I think, I run, and I like to laugh. I think that really helps. And I think also, working at Northeastern has really been, I think, incredibly helpful, because I think in university-based context, we take ourselves where the structure is a prestige economy where we take ourselves really seriously. It's about the individual. So working in a working context that really has a little bit of that, but it's not necessarily 100% predicated on that. I think it just creates a little bit less conditions for a particular kind of burnout, right? But thanks for that question. What do you do? What's your response? I think that's an important question, like how do we sustain ourselves, for the long haul, for changes that we may not even benefit from, but we are going to work for 50 years, towards. Yeah. Do you have a Maria? Do you have one?
I also ran, and it has kept me sane. Yes. It really does help.
Yeah, great. Long distance running, I feel like.
Yes.
My knees and hips go, I don't know.
Walk.
Swim. Yeah, walk, swim, being active in the world, right, in some way.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if somebody else has more questions. I have one question, another question, but please, if you have one, go ahead. This question is about, since we have a panel full of students in the morning. And so as the Chomsky Award recipient, that we really are amazed for all your work and activism. So what are your words? What would you say to these young people, students, but also young activists? What would you say as to how to continue doing this work? How will you be inspired? What are the things that matter?
We need you. We love you. We are, we're so, I'm just imagining, I feel very excited, not to sort of, say that young people are the solution, because we all have different kinds of contributions to make. But I think that this political moment has been really amplified and propelled by young people doing all different kinds of work, right? Both being in the streets, asking questions in classrooms, writing for school newspapers, right? So I think that I think acknowledging kind of the collective work that people have done that has brought us to this moment is really important, and reflecting on that. And also, being, sort of, which I think JSA seems to do really well, is create a welcoming space for people to continue the process of inquiry and see the process of inquiry collectively as connected to movements for liberation, right, and movements for freedom. Because I think we're often not, so welcoming. We're not welcoming to, newer people to, fields of study, fields of practice, fields of thinking. Right? So trying to have that sort of energy and joy and recognition and openness and, welcomingness, which I think this organization, seems to do really well. I think that seems, that would be my kind of quick but easy response, and then also that we need them. I do think that movements for liberation are tiring, exhausting, and extract an enormous cost, right? A cost that's differentially borne. I think as the history of social movements can teach us anything, like who's still locked up as political prisoners across the United States, sure isn't a heck of a lot of white people, right? So I do think that there are significant costs for any kinds of political work, and that's one dramatic example. But there are other less dramatic examples. But I also think it's important to, highlight that, we need people to build the world that we know what we need. And, Barbara Ransby has the piece about kind of leaderful movements, and that we can all see ourselves as sort of doing, kind of different kinds of leadership work in this moment, rather than kind of waiting for someone to tell us what to do. And I think that the young people attached to this political moment and the Black Lives Matter uprising have really kind of echoed that, right? And there are many, many, many ways to sort of participate in that work. So those are just some, maybe a little facile, but I think important reminders, because sometimes we think, oh, the work is so dour, it's long, but also trying to, elevate the kind of joyous possibility and the need to work towards radical futures. And the first step, is to imagine something different, right? Which is often the biggest hurdle for many people.
Yes.
Just wanted to say thank you so much for, I know how hard it is to put together a convening, particularly online, and all the work that folks have done to make this weekend possible. And for the particular honor today, and also the Q&A, which I enormously enjoyed.
Thank you so much, Erica. We really feel very honored to have you with us. We are really impressed by all the work and that you have put into, the struggles for justice. And yeah, we're happy to have you.
It's my honor, and I'm easy to find online if people have any follow-up questions or want to reach out. And yeah, thank you.